I wonder if people understand what storing in the cloud is, though, right? Is it just like a bunch of hard drives floating in a cloud?
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Mythbusters. Can we call it that? Is that a trademark still? James, our legal team, we're going to get on that. We're going to figure out if that's a trademark or not. But welcome to SCW's version of Mythbusters, and we could spell it differently if we need to. We've got some awesome experts with us again today, James and Gil. How you guys doing?
Good.
I think we're the security myth dash busters. I think that's
Oh, we're demystifying.
Yes. So we're good there. Okay, great. Makes me feel better. Today, we're talking about storage. We're going to be busting the myths of storage in surveillance systems. There's too many myths. There's too many just to pick one. So that's why we're going to be just unpacking it all. And we're going to be diving into all the different questions we get asked, maybe common misconceptions, things like that.
Cool.
I think first where we should begin though, gentlemen, is where exactly does the footage go? Like how do systems record?
A whole bunch of VCRs that are in a closet. Oh no, that was 20 years ago.
It's gonna be anywhere, right?
Right?
I mean, we have a lot of options these days. You got, let's talk about the typical setup that most people end up having as an NVR, right? So, or DVR potentially too. And typically in those setups, the storage are right in those devices or in the DVR. They're in the NVR, hence the network video recorder R part of the acronym, or the DVR, digital video recorder. So the hard drives are typically stored there. And then of course we have cloud, which I don't even know if we want to touch, but that would potentially be stored on a server somewhere, with Amazon or, somebody else. So
I think it's important. I think it's important to cover cloud. Sorry, Gil.
That's all right. Whatever the device is that we say the storage is going on, it has to have something inside of it that actually stores the data.
Gotcha. That's a very good way of putting it, actually, right? Because you can even have, I think, what people call like onboard storage, right?
Yeah, I was just about to say that. Sometimes cameras, you can get SD cards, or some of them have them built in now where they can store straight to the camera too. So there's a bunch of different ways where your footage could be stored. But I think one reality is it does have to record somewhere, whether that's internal on a central storage like an NVR or potentially in a cloud. Those are three of the most common, I would say. But really in the industry, I don't know what percentage it is really, but for the vast majority, I would say you have an NVR and it's stored locally just for various reasons.
I wonder if people understand what storing in the cloud is, though, right? Is it just like a bunch of hard drives floating in a cloud?
Right. Floats in there and everything's perfect.
Right. And I think that is such a good place to go. At first, I think let's understand kind of like where the industry is dominantly. And I think I would agree that it's in like local on premise or maybe backed up somewhere else, but generally on device somewhere, right? On an NVR.
Yeah, I mean, from the earliest days of recording video, it's been on-site storage,
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to the history of it, like we talked about prior, it all started with, VCRs, and they had tapes. And then it, morphed into hard drives. And actually there were other types of storage, there were DAT drives and 8mm and all kinds of different things that you could use back then, that different companies tried to invent to be the storage of the future, but it all ended up being hard drives. So,
Right.
Fun fact, casinos used to have a camera per location, and every camera had its own VCR, and every tape had to be replaced every day. So they had a gentleman, and his full-time primary job was to be the tape replacer.
Wow.
Every casino.
That's wild. That is wild. We've come a long way since the tape replacer. That's for sure.
Right.
And I'm going to start using that term all the time. That's awesome. That's great. So we have come a long way. We have come a long way. Predominant way people store is usually using hard drives, right? And these are surveillance rated hard drives. Are these special hard drives? What kind of hard drives are these? Like the one that's in my computer?
So a hard drive is kind of the same one that you'd have on if your desktop computer did have a hard drive still, but they're built differently. They're built for 24/7 operation, to be operating all the time, to be writing to the hard drive all the time. Whereas your desktop computer at work, you're on it for 8 hours a day, and then really you're only probably writing a small amount of data throughout the day. Whereas a video, you get 10 cameras, that's recording all of them at the same time. It's a pretty big workload. So they're built to survive that workload, and you definitely want to make sure you get surveillance rated drive. That's like one of the biggest myths off the top of the head, that they can just go on Amazon buy the cheapest hard drive, and then 6 months later their hard drive stops working and they lost all their footage and they're not recording until they replace one. Pretty big issue.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'd say it's very common, very common. And so first, I mean, we said a lot of great things there. I want to back up and say, okay, so we get an NVR, or back in the day, we get a DVR. Does it come with hard drives in it? Like, what's the deal? It sounds like I can put my own hard drives in it, maybe, potentially.
Sometimes, I mean, sometimes, they sell them in the box with a drive in it, just pre-configured, done, pretty simple, usually smaller or, consumer grade stuff. But if you have recorders that are adaptable to bigger hard drives or more storage, then you can adapt those with adding the hard drives after the fact. So you have some recorders that have a single bay for a single hard drive. Some have up to 4, some have up to 16. It all depends on what you want to get. And then you can add storage after the fact as you need it. So usually start with a minimum amount of storage based on how much storage time you need. And then you can add from there if your recorder will allow that, So you can start with smaller drives too, like 2, 4, 6, 8 terabyte. And then find out, okay, I need a little bit extra. Nowadays you can go to a 12 and even a 14 terabyte now, I think we're rated at. So yeah.
Gotcha. So it's very a la carte now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's like the biggest change in the last, we're still storing them on the same kind of hard drive, but the sizes have gone up a lot over the last. I remember I got like a 6 terabyte drive, and I actually posted it on like social media. I'm like, this is the coolest thing. It's like how many hours of video, how many hours of songs you could listen to on it. And now we're up to, 14 on a single disc. So that's like, we're doing a lot of the similar stuff that has been done a while, but obviously hard drive technology has improved over the last 20 years as well to make them more compact, cooler, everything that, an NVR needs for them to work right.
Gotcha. So I'm starting to get things. Okay, I got the system. I've got an NVR, something to record. I need to get hard drives to put in it. Sounds like I can add hard drives if I need to, right? I can kind of
yeah.
if it's capable.
You might have a recorder that has 2 hard drive bays, but you start with one, and you have an extra hard drive bay to add storage down the road. And like I said, that's configurable based on what type of recorder you have. We have what's the biggest one we have? 16 drive bays.
We have one that does 24, I think.
24.
Actually.
There you go.
Yeah,
that's monstrous, right? You can just
that's a lot.
Endless storage.
Right. So before we get into any of the questions I have regarding that, let's first cover exactly how do I determine like what size hard drive I need, or how many hard drives and that type of stuff. Like what factors go into that?
Well, you just weigh the hard drive, and if it weighs 2 pounds, then that will get you approximately 2 weeks of storage. No?
Oh, yes.
By
Finally,
weight.
someone explained it to me. Thank you.
No?
I wish.
Well, then I guess we have to do calculations, right?
Yeah. I think that's where like going with somebody, not to press the sales button yet, but like, we're going with somebody who's actually going to work with you to figure that out. So, you don't have to know what a terabyte is when you call us. You're going to say like, hey, I really want to retain about 2 weeks of footage, and we're going to sit there. We're going to calculate how many. So there's a lot of factors that get involved. We'll talk about. We'll calculate that out and get you the number that you need and install it for you and everything like that. But Gil, do you want to like talk about the different numbers that we're gonna have to put in this calculator?
Yeah. So you're gonna need to know, obviously frame rate. So how many frames per second that you're interested in getting recordings of. and that matters. Well, back in the day, they used to say that, 24 frames per second was what the human eye could see. So a lot of people want to get somewhere in there. You see 30 frames per second as a standard. So you calculate that with your file size, which is your frame rate. Your resolution. These days, obviously, we're working a lot with 4 and 8 terabyte record cameras, and those have higher resolutions, which means they have a higher frame rate, so to speak. I guess that would be the proper term. And then that calculation goes together and creates, how much total storage a single camera recording would be for a certain time period. Time period is the other factor. How long do we want to record that particular camera with those particulars coming from it, the frame rate, the resolution, and the time.
Makes sense. So then we get those numbers, we calculate, right, how many terabytes or how much space of hard drive space we need, right? And then that'll tell us kind of like what hard drives.
Yeah, and the other piece of the puzzle also is how much movement is in the picture, because the way our compression works these days, it takes a keyframe and it does that as a base, and then has frames adjusting with all the movement associated with it. So the more movement in it makes a bigger file, which causes the requirement for more storage space. So that's something to keep in mind, because if you have, a camera looking at a field where there's nothing happening versus a camera looking at a train station, which everything is happening, you're going to have different file size because of so much more movement. So you have to keep, this all goes into the blender, so to speak, and spits out a base number of storage amount that's going to be required for the time you need.
Right. Yep. So there's a lot that goes into it, is what I'm hearing. Like more than you need this much start.
Yes. But we have calculators for that, thank God.
That's what I was about to say. Luckily, we got a calculator on our website that sort of simplifies that. So you go in, and the first option on the calculator is number of cameras, and you would put in how many cameras you have, and then you would put in, next step is days of footage, and you're going to put in how many days of footage do I want to retain. Now, this is the question that you're going to have to ask, because some people are fine with just having 7 days, and when we say days of retention, that means that in day number 7, what happens is the NVR doesn't just erase the entire hard drive. It's going to go back to day number 1 and start overwriting that. And so your oldest footage on hand is going to be erased as time goes on.
And that's called what?
Recycling.
FIFO? How we call that?
What was that? I'm sorry.
FIFO.
FIFO. I'm not sure if I heard that term.
First in, first out.
Oh, first in, first out.
First in, out.
I usually use the recycling symbol as my analogy for people, or a snake eating its own tail. We've used that a lot at SCW. I don't know why.
Kind of snake eating its tail. I like
kind of gross too, but yeah, we've used that. But yeah, that's kind of how it is. So you might be in a situation where certain industries require you to have 30 days of footage. Some of them require you to have 60, 90, sometimes more. It really depends on what you're comfortable with doing. Of course, the more you have, the more you're gonna have to pay for more hard drives, etc. So typically people keep it about 2 weeks on average, I would say, in my experience. But so yeah, usually we'd select how many days you want in there. Then you select your resolution in frames per second, which are going to be depending on what cameras you're purchasing, and then it's going to spit out a number, and that number is either by motion recording or by continuous recording. And so with motion, it's it's giving you about a high estimate, about 75% activity. So that way you're covered, just in case you end up having one that's on all day and one that's maybe less busy. And so it averages out. So, and that way you'll know exactly how much terabytes you have. You can also, of course, again, ask us, and we're happy to clarify that, especially for larger ones. That's where you really want to start digging in, where when you have 100 cameras and you need to retain 30 days, that's when you really want to start digging into okay, how much, start to calculate that almost on an individual camera basis, so you don't underestimate where you're going to need to get that time period, but also you don't overestimate it to where you're spending so much on hard drives that end up being overkill. So you got
Yeah,
to find that medium.
that's perfect explanation, James. You nailed it. Everything you said is what's required. And the back end of these calculators that we have, and a lot of other brands in the industry have, they all pretty much do the exact same thing. They just do it in different ways, but they spit out the same thing. You put in the information pretty much the same, and it works good, and it gets you close. The biggest problem I've ever seen clients have with storage is they're not sure where that end storage date should be. I'll give you a prime example. We had an incident actually in our own company yesterday where our warehouse needed to search something out because a client said they didn't get something. They went back to go find the footage, and it had just started recording over that information. That happens to a lot of people a lot of time because you just need to be aware of exactly how much storage you need to be able to go back long enough to find the footage that you require. So
Yeah,
if I can think of anything to tell you, figure that number out.
And it's not, and it may be different, right? Like depending on the industry or your situation or circumstances, but
Oh, it's different for everybody. I mean, in the retail world, you might have someone come back 8 months later with a slip and fall. You know, they finally decide to go get a lawyer or something, right? Who knows? Yeah, I don't know what the statute of limitation is on stuff like that. But
no, but liability is a big thing. Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah,
Huge. All right, so I figure all that out. What happens if the hard drive fails? I lose everything.
that's where we get really into the trenches. We're gonna live to our main stake, but there's an option called RAID, and what that. So actually, let me even go back a little bit. There's in the traditional NVR, most of the time it's going to record if you have two hard drives, and it's going to record from hard drive number 1, fill that up, and then it's going to record to hard drive number 2, and it's going to fill that one up. Then it's going to go back to hard drive number 1 and start overwriting that. So let's just say hard drive 1 starts to fail. All of the footage that's on hard drive number 1 is lost unless you do something called RAID or some form of backup, obviously. So we have an entire video on RAID that you can really go into and talk about the different levels, but RAID protects you against certain hard drive failures. You can have situations where you have one hard drive fail and you don't lose a second of footage. There's an option called RAID 6, which allows you to lose 2 hard drives and it doesn't lose a second of footage. Of course, that requires additional hard drives to support that functionality, but yeah, for the most part, then that's another really good reason to use surveillance grade drives, because of all the importance in the system, this is one thing you can't really underestimate, is how important is that footage on your hard drive in the event it's lost.
Yeah, and you can't, most recorders, standard NVRs and DVRs, you can't hot swap them, which means there's nothing that's going to keep recording as you switch out a bad hard drive. It's just, you're going to lose footage at that time. You're going to lose the footage of the bad hard drive, and it's just going to have to swap it out and bite the bullet. So what James is talking about prevents that from happening, but it is a little bit more cost.
Yeah, which, that's fair, right? If you're getting that redundancy. So, okay,
Yep.
Makes sense. I get storage for traditional systems. It sounds like a lot. Sounds like it's going to be a lot of money and a lot to figure out. Sounds like the cloud's going to be easier.
No, not in my opinion.
It really depends on the setup. Like some of them, it's what's easier about the cloud is in a lot of cases you specify your days. You don't even think about the terabyte. You don't even the term terabyte's not even used. You put in I want to record for 60 days, and then it's going to retain 60 days. The system's going to know. That's great. But there's cloud storage is a recurring cost. You buy your hard drives, you might spend $1,500 on hard drives, and then you go to cloud and you may be spending $300 a month for that equivalent amount of space. And then so in a couple months, all of a sudden you've gone from the cost of the hard drives, and now you're gonna have to retain that for as long as the footage is there, as long as you have your system, basically. So it's definitely not, a less expensive option. I want to make that very clear. Cloud storage is
Yeah.
very expensive, and it's complicated because then you have to figure out, how do I get the footage from my local business here to the cloud?
That's gonna be
How
my next
fast is your
question.
upload speed? What kind of quality are they going to be able to send that in? There's a lot of factors there you really have to consider. So usually
I
people
have
think
to have my
cloud.
system connected to the internet for cloud storage.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, when I said, is it, you asked if it's easier, and I said, no, not really. I guess it's easier when it comes to not even having to worry about anything as far as hardware is
Mm,
concerned. But
yeah.
as
yeah.
far as, concerns over connectivity, loss of service, those things happen quite a bit.
Yeah.
Uh,
Your
Right.
internet goes down, what
I was
happens?
gonna say that, right?
You
Yeah.
might even have to pay for both local and, that one-time local fee, and then also cloud. And that's really a smart way of doing it. It's sort of called a hybrid cloud, where you have local storage combined with some form of cloud storage, whether that's, one-to-one in the cloud, or more like a timed backup, or maybe like a lower quality backup in the cloud. Really, I mean, there's billions of variations on it, of course, but yeah, you have to ask yourself very simply, what kind of internet connection do you have? How often is it going out? And what happens when that does happen? Because there are some systems out there as well that if your internet goes out, you're screwed. You don't have footage during that time, and
right.
they're kind of designed for people out in Silicon Valley who don't have any issues with internet ever. But if you're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and you might have a little bit more occasional outages and stuff like that because of storms and stuff. It's something you really have to ask yourself, if that's the smart thing to do, or if that's what you want to
Yeah.
rely on, really.
Mhm.
I mean, everything's improving, right? So, we might have this conversation 5 years from now and laugh at the fact that we used to store on site.
Sure.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a
I
good
mean,
point.
internet speeds have gotten better in the US as time's gone on, as well. Like, I mean, when I was in tech support 5 years ago, and doing that stuff daily, I knew how bad people's internet connections were, especially their upload
Right.
speeds. The
Mhm.
speed that you can send video over to another place on the internet, and most of the time you couldn't send one camera there. Now we're getting to the point where maybe you can send one camera, maybe you can send two or three. It's getting better, and it's obviously always going to get better for that. So that's one of the big bottlenecks right now, I think, for it. And then of course the cost with it too. That's the other
Yeah.
big bottleneck. It's never going to be probably more affordable. It's always, but there are going to be advantages to that over time. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I agree.
No, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense. That's why we've been doing it on premise. I think there's also that notion of people being worried because the storage is so important, right? It's like one of the main reasons of the system. What happens if it gets stolen? You know, like if the inverter gets stolen or something, right? Can't that happen? Isn't that a thing or no?
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's just it. It's like redundancy is basically as much as you want to pay for. You can be
That's a really
redundant
good
on
way of putting it.
everything. You just got to be
Mhm.
willing to pay for it. It's all out there. The ability to cover all these questions. What if this and what if that, it can all be covered. We can take care of any of it. It just costs. And
Yeah.
so it's just, if you're willing to pay for it, the opportunity to have a fully redundant system with electrical, network, backup storage, everything is
Right.
feasible. You
Right.
just got to be
yeah,
willing.
Right. Right.
couldn't have said it better. Yeah, that's a perfect way of putting it.
Wow, that's such a good point. It's so true too. It's so true. That's good. Well, I mean, I covered a lot of my bases for storage. What do you all feel? How do you feel? Experts, what do we think? What are we missing? What are we not thinking about
I
when it
think we
comes to
gave it
storage?
out there. I think we put it out there.
Yeah,
I think
I
we
mean, it's like,
demystified.
yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of options out there. There's a lot of lingo you're gonna find. There's a lot of terminology you might find. But you know, if you're working with somebody, ask those questions. Feel free to ask them, what happens if my hard drive fails? And if you're concerned about that and they don't really have a good answer for you, maybe try to dig into a little bit more, see, because doing a RAID setup isn't that much more in the long term. The initial cost, you pay a couple more buy one more hard drive basically for some of them. And then you've got redundancy in the case of any failure. And it's, that peace of mind is worth it for most people once they realize that option is there. So if you ask those questions to whoever's you're purchasing from, whoever potentially might be installing your system, and if they can't give you an answer and you don't feel comfortable, start really digging in, see if because that's your storage again is your footage is the key. That's what you bought your system for. So don't slack off or in that aspect, I think is what I would say.
Yeah, I think two of the three redundant packages we've discussed are not as expensive as people think. They are a little bit more. The RAID we just talked about, and having a backup for power, some kind of UPS, uninterruptible power source. You have those two things. The third thing, which would be internet connectivity, it's hard to back that up. You hope that your internet service provider kind of does, and you have to check and see how good you are locally if you're on fiber or whatever. But other than that, at least two of the three main things we can do, and it's fairly cost effective if you want.
Yeah, we're talking a couple $100. We're not talking a couple $1,000 to achieve a RAID and a backup battery. And should be noted too, just in case anybody is kind of curious, with an NVR system, unless you have it set up in a very interesting way, most of ours were set up in a way where if internet goes down, it doesn't affect your actual video aspect of it. It just means you won't be able to access it on your phone or, somewhere remote.
Right.
In that case. So just want to make sure
Yeah.
people didn't think that if the internet goes down, the footage goes down. That might happen with cloud.
That's right. Yeah,
Depending on how
exactly.
they do it, but not with a traditional NVR or a hybrid cloud setup potentially as well.
Great point. Yeah, internet going down only affects cloud storage. So we actually cover everything on site if we have a RAID and a backup battery.
Yep.
For sure.
And that is one of the advantages of doing it with physical components, right? And locally there, and there are other backup options too, by the way, besides just cloud, right? So I think that's important to know too, right? That.
And some people double up with the on-camera storage too. Plenty of people do that. That's pretty.
Yeah, on the camera directly. Yeah. Right. With SD cards and stuff. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. That's awesome. And we do have, and we'll have links to those videos, those separate videos, like NAS devices, SD cards, built on storage, right? That stuff. Links in the descriptions below. Be sure to check those out. Experts, unless I'm missing anything, I think that'll wrap this episode up.
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah, we're good.
Go get some storage, people.
Heck yes. And ask the questions, right? Like James said, if you don't feel confident in the answer, make sure you make yourself feel confident, right?
Absolutely.
So feel free to contact our support team, our sales team with any questions you might have. We're happy to walk through any of this stuff with you and what our devices are capable of. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of SCW Mythbusters Storage. If you have any ideas, drop them in the comments below. Thank you so much.
See ya.
Awesome.